Welcome to the Spencertown Festival of Books, which, as with last year, is virtual once again. And we're from the Spencertown Academy, which is located in Spencertown, New York, Columbia County. My name is Gerald Seligman, and I'm on the committee of the festival and on the board. And today we have a very special presentation. Michael Kupperman, who is with us to talk about his graphic memoir, All the Answers. And just to give you an idea of how it was received, in 2018, when it was first published, not only NPR and Publishers Weekly called it a book of the year, but so too did Vulture, did Library Journal, New York Public Library, and it was a winner of the Publishers Weekly Critics Poll in 2018, and finally a 2019 Eisner Award nominee for Best Reality-Based Work. So, in other words, All the Answers by Michael Kupperman is one of the most celebrated works in the genre, and we are very pleased to have him with us today at the Spencertown Festival of Books. He'll be interviewed by Brian Heater, and Brian will make a full introduction. But first, to tell you a little bit about Brian, he's the host of the Boing Boing Network podcast, RIYL, and an editor at TechCrunch. As well as that, he was a founder and former editor-in-chief of the comics news site, The Daily Crosshatch, and has appeared as a regular contributor on NPR. So his writing finally has appeared in Spin and Wired and Playboy, Entertainment Weekly, The Onion, Boing Boing, Publishers Weekly, The Daily Beast, and so on. So as you can see, an ideal interviewer for a renowned graphic memoirist. Before we begin, I just want to tell you a few things. At the bottom of your screen, you'll notice there's a Q&A tab, and we will be accumulating any questions you may have that you would like to ask Michael Kupperman. And then at the end, we'll leave some time to cover some of those answers. And also, this is the last session of our virtual Festival of Books, and we have all the previous ones from this year and from last year online on our YouTube page, Spencertown Academy. And you can check on us in spencertownacademy.org to find out about our online book sale, which has wonderful rare books, art books, design books, signed author copies, and new books are being added. And this is running until October 31st. So spencertownacademy.org. So without further ado, which is what one says in such a circumstance, I'd like to introduce both Brian Heater and Michael Kupperman to talk about All the Answers.
Great. Gerald, thank you so much. Thanks for setting this up. I don't know if the two of us were on screen during that introduction, but I should note that Michael was taking a giant sip of water when Gerald called it one of the most celebrated books in the medium. So you all missed an almost fantastic. Oh, should we do that again? Okay. We'll get to the spit takes by the end of the conversation. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for that great introduction. I'm very excited to be speaking with Michael Kupperman tonight. Like many people, I first became aware of Michael's work through comedy books like Snake and Bacon's Cartoon Cabaret, his long-running series, Tales Designed to Thrizzle. Many of these characters in these series have appeared in animated form in TV Funhouse on Comedy Central. Snake and Bacon actually got their own pilot on Adult Swim. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with Michael a number of times over the years. He's appeared on my podcast. I've interviewed him for a number of sites. I actually went to a party in his very lovely apartment in Brooklyn. But in spite of all of this, up until a few years ago, I wasn't entirely clear about his background and his history. Thankfully, that was cleared up in the very fittingly titled All the Answers, which was published on Gallery 13 back in 2018. Michael, you and I were discussing the book the other night in preparation for this conversation, and I said, I don't remember there being any jokes in the 200 plus pages of this book, which is obviously very out of character for you. the kind of absurdist, I think you've described it as Dadaist humor that we've seen in works like Thrizzle, is not really present here. Is All the Answers your first purely serious work?
Yeah, of any length, yes. Outside of anything I did for magazines. Yeah, it would be the first really serious thing, and the first thing that wasn't funny at all.
It's ostensibly a biography about your father, Joel Kupperman, and we'll discuss the ostensible part a little bit later. He was a panelist on a wildly successful radio series called Quiz Kids. But growing up, what was your sense of your father's fame?
Well, that it was a very painful subject for him that wasn't to be mentioned, that we shouldn't bring it up or ask any questions about it. And of course, I grew up in the 1970s, and by then it was fading. Fewer people remembered him by then. But there were still, you'd still come across mentions of him, like in Rocky and Bullwinkle, or, looking at old Time magazines, which I did because I was a weird kid. There'd still be these odd little reminders of his fame. But his fame had been, when I finally looked at it years later, his fame has been so odd that, just these traces remain. It's not, and a culture, I guess, some cultural memory of him. Excuse me.
You alluded to this a little bit, but what exactly was his relationship to that fame, and was it something that he, if not kept secret, just didn't really discuss growing up?
It was obviously the occasion for paranoia. He was scared of the fame. He was scared that they would come looking for him. He was scared, of talking about it or of being in front of the public eye ever again. And I think, yes, it's in the book. The last time it happened was when someone at the University of Connecticut threw a Quiz Kids seminar, kind of, celebration of the Quiz Kids, which seemed very pointedly done on his doorstep. And his response was to flee the country for a week.
Yeah, which he ended up doing a couple of times over the years. You touch on this a bit, but it was the one sort of respite he was able to find in all of this, was actually physically leaving the country and going to England.
Yes, and unfortunately not staying there. I think it would have been a very different story if he had stayed there, especially in 1957, but he didn't.
Yeah, so he obviously went on to be a very successful published author, university professor, released a number of philosophy books over the years. Did he ever actually, to your knowledge, sit down and attempt to document his years in show business?
Yes, I think he tried to write an autobiography in the early 70s when we were in England. I think the distance may have given him the feeling that he could try. I don't know exactly what occasioned it, but he managed to write one chapter of an autobiography in which he kind of skirts the fact of him being on the Quiz Kids and ends up on the other side of it, as if the discussion is over. It was clear he was not able to deal with it. I mean, this is one of the things that really troubles me about the way he lived, is that he wrote a lot about character, morality, and ethics and human behavior. But he really didn't want to think about the experiences he'd been through. He didn't really want to dissect them and try to understand them. And to a level I find kind of profound.
Yeah, it was so scarring to him that he was a math genius. All of the questions that people were at, he had these great little parlor tricks. He would go around and people would ask him to add and multiply numbers. But it sounds like it was such a difficult experience that he moved as far away from math as one could go and still continue to be in academia by getting into philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. Everything that was a signifier of his time on the Quiz Kids, of anything he'd done back then, he got as far away from as he could. His interest in sports, all the things he was supposed to be. I mean, I was really surprised to hear on the Quiz Kids when I was researching the book that he could play the piano quite well, it sounded like to me. I literally never heard him play the piano or suggest that he could.
Had you, prior to actually like sitting down and writing all the answers, had you explored the idea of doing a biography about him?
It came gradually. I thought it was an interesting subject. And then at a certain point, it seemed like it might be a way to connect with him. I found connecting with him very difficult, maybe even harder as an adult than it had been as a child. And it was obvious, there was limited time in his life. So it seemed like a possibility that if I could start to extract this information, and I have to say, again, he seemed completely willing and even a little eager at the time to do it. It's just that when we finally sat down and talked about it, he had erased all his memories so thoroughly, there was nothing there. Even the memories of the memories were gone. He didn't even remember, as far as I can tell, that he had hidden these scrapbooks of his career in the house. It had just all gone.
Now, when you say erased, it sounds like you're implying that it was purposeful, that it was intentional, that he was, blocking these things out. But I assume it's hard to parse intentionality from the fact that he suffered from dementia for the last several years of his life.
Right, but even before that, he was someone who would compartmentalize things and then not think about them in a very deliberate way. And yes, I think that is what he did with his all the events of his childhood leading up to when he was 21 and possibly a little after. I think he erased them all very deliberately because they were too painful to consider. He lived in a very see no evil, hear no evil, say no evil kind of way. And I think the memories of his past were evil to him.
Which to a certain degree was probably a product of the time, right? Of just, people, from the standpoint of, I guess say what you will as far as where we are now as a society, but people tend to, at least surface wise, be more open about ideas of trauma and grief and processing some of these issues.
Yes. But they were very not aware of those things back then. And so on the Quiz Kids, besides him, you'd have kids who had literally escaped from the Holocaust the week before, on the air. It was really a heady mix of, politics and culture. I should also mention that the thing about the Quiz Kids was it was a very popular radio show that was on every week, but also during the war, they toured the United States almost incessantly. And so he went to, I think, nearly all of the 50 states in a few years' time, doing local shows, performing, but also visiting military plants, naval bases, the seats of government. It's kind of amazing how there were no boundaries back then in some ways. And the Quiz Kids, for instance, visited Truman and met Truman twice, once right before he became president, and then a few weeks after, because it was 1944 and he didn't have anything better to do than meet the Quiz Kids a second time. It's really amazing.
Yeah, and you'll probably touch on this a little bit later, but there's a parade of the most famous people at the time who he had opportunity to meet. You mentioned Truman, president of the United States, but also Henry Ford, who obviously loomed very large over the time for a number of reasons. And there's clear contrast there because you and your father was Jewish, and the vast, I think, were all of the Quiz Kids Jewish? Is that right?
No,
most
not
of
all.
them?
No.
Okay.
No.
But
it was
a disproportionate number.
Yeah. Of the touring group, I think 3 were Gentiles and 2 were Jewish, I think. Or was it the other way around? There was a predominance of Jews, certainly, at certain times.
Yeah.
And I do think that was at least in some degree due to the producer, Lewis Cowan, and his desire for representation. He was really ahead of his time on that, and did things like push for representation in radio, and he was a big believer in equality.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I bring up Ford from the standpoint of, having disseminated the protocols of
the
the
most
elements of
notorious
Zion.
anti-Semite of his day.
Yeah, being close personal buddies with the Fuhrer is my understanding. But that's a big part of, representation at that point meant something very specific as far as being Jewish during World War II. It was, I got the sense in certain scenes in the book that it was an opportunity to almost like show some of the people from outside of these major cities that like Jewish people are people.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of entertainment like that around then, and I think it all had the same general point. And I think his fame doesn't really make sense without it. There's no reason why a kid who is good at math would be that big a deal. I really don't think he would have been that famous, in that way at any other time in history.
Yeah, but I mean, you've listened to some of the tapes, you've gone back and watched the videos. I mean, he was very engaging. He was a very precocious child, and he was, the impression that I get having read the book is he was very good at this specific thing.
Yeah, when he felt like it. If he wasn't sulking. You can see in some of the pictures or recordings he's sulking. But no, he was very engaging. And the thing was about him was he was a smart kid who loved to answer questions, but he was the kind of kid who you could be laughing at him and he wouldn't stop. You know what I mean? He'd keep on talking with the same confidence that what he was saying was interesting, even when people are going, Joel, so he was kind of a comic character too, in his unself-awareness. And I think that was one of the other ingredients why he was such a big deal, or why people found him adorable.
So, having mulled over the creation of this book, and as you said earlier, this having been a long process of putting all the pieces together, when did you finally really pull the trigger and start working on the book in earnest?
Boy, I started thinking I should just at least try to get my father to answer some questions in, I think, 2011 or 2012. Even so, I didn't really get serious about doing a book until a couple of years later. And then it took quite a while to see what kind of a story I thought I could tell from it. It's so subjective. And again, the most important witness, is not present, or was not present, because he had no memory of anything. So I finally got a proposal together and got the contract for the book in August 2016, an exciting year. And then I finished the book in the next 2 years. And I actually finished it 3 weeks before it came out. 3 weeks before. No, that can't be right. 6 weeks. 6 weeks before it came out.
Yeah.
But it was quite close. It was a struggle. The end was the biggest struggle as it was, coming due, to try to find a way to put it that wasn't too much born of frustration, anger, or sadness, to try to give it something more positive.
Well, that brings up a really good point. You are, as I said earlier, ostensibly a biography of him. And the reason why I say that is because this is as much, if not more, the story of the dynamics between a father and a son. It's the story of your figuring out your father's own story and coping with your relationship over time. And you're a central character in the book from basically the beginning. I think you appear for the first time on page 4. At what point in the writing process was it clear that this was more than just a straight biography?
Yeah, that was a heavy decision to make, that I had to do that, but it just didn't make any sense as a simple third person examination of him, especially when it was really becoming obvious that a lot of the things that had traumatized him had a kind of knock-on effect on me. as a comic artist, I find that I have warring impulses to get attention and to avoid attention. And the one to avoid attention is very insidious and very, can find a million ways to express itself, but it's always there. And working on this made me realize I don't know how much comes from, inherited trauma, but certainly I was brought up to behave that way. That was an integral part of bringing up was be quiet, don't get attention, attention is trouble, and that's something I still struggle with all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that impulse just from the standpoint of, I've read so many works where the artist inserts themselves and there's no reason for them to be there. But this is the story of your father. Obviously it seems like it was unavoidable. I mean, do you feel like you could have just written a good straight biography about your dad?
No, I don't. I mean, it's so hard. It's writing about show business and wartime society when things were the most ephemeral they've ever been, when paper was literally being gathered and recycled in the war effort. It's just most of the people are gone. I think if I had tried to do it maybe 20 years ago, possibly, or 30 years, but I think by now it just would be, a collection of impressions. To write this book, I did a lot of research, which I'll show you a little bit of in a moment, but I had to really use my intuition. And part of the intuition was based on what had he been the most forgetful about, what he had been the most scared of remembering. There were moments in the Quiz Kids that he could kind of remember a little, but the 1957 quiz show thing, he professed to have completely forgotten, at least at some times, and then said, don't let anyone find out, don't let anyone know. He said this just a few years ago. He was still terrified of being found out about the quiz show business.
So let's talk about that. As I mentioned at the top, he had a few opportunities in his life, including one early on. He realized that he could go away to college, that he could go to the UK, and the nature of media and radio at the time was such that people outside of the US didn't know the show, and his fame didn't follow him. I don't know that I would say that there is necessarily a primary antagonist in the book, but your grandmother, his mother, is certainly a very complicated character throughout and a driving force here. She was a big part of why, she was the reason why he was on the quiz show. What's her role in all of this?
Yeah, she's the reason why everything bad that happened to him. It's hard because you don't want to demonize your grandmother, a struggling immigrant woman, but she made such disastrous decisions, and he really would have, I think, been a much healthier and happier person if he had left the show, after a few years, which is what most of the other kids did. No one else just stayed on like he did.
How many years was he on the Quiz Kids?
His first show was April 29th, 1942, when he was 5 years old. He turned 6 a few weeks later. And he was on the show until he was 16. Mm-hmm. And as I think I said in the book, it gets very cloudy about when he left. There's this enormous fanfare about all of his appearances at the very start. And then at the end, it's very murky. The show was not, a huge hit for NBC on TV. It was being transferred to CBS. I believe he was on the CBS show for a while, but there's no mention of his final show. And it's hard to tell when exactly he left. It's just clear that he left at a certain point during, a certain period of time.
And she was essentially, your sense is that she was what was keeping him there.
Yeah, my sense is he probably had to, practically fight her in combat to get off the show at all. I think she was very insistent that he stay on. And then it was her who set him up to be on this rigged game show in 1957 when he came back from England for a visit. And I don't think she ever really stopped thinking that he should be on TV. It's absolutely bizarre. After he had been hired as a university professor, or maybe an associate professor at that time, but when my mother's first meeting with her after their wedding, she pulled out a scrapbook and started to show her and was like, how do we get him back into what he should be doing, which is being on TV, you know? And if you've seen any of the footage of my father, I don't know if there's probably one or two on YouTube. It's not a comfortable, pleasant viewing experience to see him. He seems not happy and is very awkward, you know. I mean, what's crazy is that also it was being broadcast by NBC at 8 o'clock Friday nights, but that's very early TV.
Yes, I think one of the things that we should probably contextualize here. So we've discussed a little bit how big of a deal the Quiz Kids show was, but like for me personally, my familiarity with the quiz show scandals of the time was from that Robert Redford movie that came up like probably in the 90s.
Sure.
Can you contextualize how big of a deal it was that some people that were cheating on quiz shows in the 50s?
Right. Well, my father and the Quiz Kids show was from an earlier era of radio. And in that time, shows were not allowed to give out big prizes. That was forbidden by the FCC. And then in the early 50s, the regulations were relaxed. And in, I think it was 55, Lewis Cowan, the same man who had come up with the Quiz Kids, came up with this idea for a game show where it would be like climbing a mountain of cash amounts to get to a huge amount. And that was the $64,000 question. And it transformed TV overnight, and it really changed TV completely. TV had been struggling in some ways till then, and it made it very hot and very exciting that people could win all this money. And these shows were run very loosely and were, fairly openly rigged. Looking through newspapers at the time, you can see references about it for years before the scandal finally broke in 1959, with the Herbert Stemple, the contestant on, I can't remember what the show was called, the one in Quiz Show. And the whole house of cards fell apart. And I think the idea that my father had been faking it during, I don't know how many appearances he made, but I think 350 appearances that he had been fed answers, it had been raised before. And I think this always before, I think he could just shrug it off, but this was something that he felt he had participated in cheating. And I think that was really a heavy blow for him.
Yeah. Was it Pyramid? Was that the show?
It was $64,000 challenge.
Challenge. Okay. So again, after as you had said, a decade of being on Quiz Kids, which was obviously a trying time for him in a number of ways, and there was a lot of time he spent on it that clearly he didn't want to be there. Why was it this relatively small period of time? This sounds like the thing that really traumatized him above all else, and that he really carried with him.
Right. Well, they had it set up so that the other contestant would actually give you the information before the show. So it was a whole system of cheating where it wasn't people from the show who were telling you to cheat. They would just kind of drop it in your lap or tell you to go read such and such. And I think it was a line he felt he'd never crossed, and that he'd crossed it on TV. That he crossed it on TV, I think was just the ultimate horror. I think it was a nightmare that he couldn't, get past. Actually, a friend of his came forward in the last year or two with a letter that he sent to him right after the quiz show appearance. Should I read it or should I?
Yeah. So this is this is a relatively recent discovery for you. And I should say, by the way, for the chat, we're going to be saving all the questions to the end, so keep asking them, and we'll get to them after this. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Okay, so this is a letter that he wrote to a friend in August 5th, 1957. Dear David, please tear up this letter after you have finished reading it. You probably saw me win money the day before yesterday. I hardly could have answered the questions if I had not been told to study those and related topics. After the show, I have felt extremely depressed and sick. I had had only a vague idea before of how things would turn out, but the full dishonesty of it bothers me, and I worry also whether my opponent has been cheated. He would have been given $1,000 had we both missed. If he has not been given that amount, I shall offer it myself. I wish that I were through with that program, but I have some sort of a commitment to continue a while, although I feel a little silly about honoring commitments when there has been so much dishonesty. I told Paul about all this as a secret between friends. Halfway through the phone conversation, I remembered that Jan was in the room. Jan says that as long as there was crooked money to be gotten, he was glad that someone intelligent got some. And after all, that I was only a tool. Paul thinks that my opponent lost deliberately. He had said all along that he wanted to lose to me. And a week ago, he asked me, just for fun, the two questions which were this week used on the show in approximate form. This may or may not have been coincidence.
So again, a piece of a document from the time that you discovered after you were done with the writing. What's the revelation here, and what information did it shed on the situation that you didn't know when you're actually in the process of writing the book?
Well, it was confirmation of what I had believed, because the idea that this show was that upsetting to him was really something I had concocted. And this confirms it. But it's also the naivete. Like, of course, the other contestant was in on it. He still hasn't processed that, and I wonder if he ever did. And at the end of the letter, he says, getting back to this awful program, I do not want recognition of the sort I'm getting. Even the best universities in America, even if the best universities in America are favorably impressed, and I very much doubt that anyone except in a place like Northwestern would be, I have enough pride to shrink from gaining a reputation by possessing worthless information. I want to something worthwhile, then gain recognition. And regards to your mother and friend, your friend Joel.
Really tossed Northwestern under the bus there. It sounds
like. No, that's a funny note. But yeah. So
let's break it down a little bit. I mean, what was it? I mean, there's a couple of things that I can read into this that are going on here. There's the personal side of things of him feeling like he's basically taking the money away from somebody else. There's, I don't know, is it this sort of somebody who I assume prides himself and has sort of built his identity on being a very smart person, potentially being unmasked as a fraud seems to come into play as well. I mean, what's at the heart of this? What was it that really stuck with him all those years?
I think that those one or two nights on the quiz show, I think made him feel like all the rest of it, all the last, however many years he'd invested in the quiz kids had been a joke. I think that one thing threw it all into a bad light, even more than it had been. And I think it was already not, a pleasant memory for him, but I think that made it all seem like it had just led to this ridiculously dishonorable thing. And the same people who had him up, in front of the microphone and then camera as a child, and had him be a quiz kid, put him in front of the camera to do this ridiculous, dishonest show.
So I really want to get into the research process of all
sure.
of this, partially because I know that you've come with some visual aids, which I think are going to be fascinating to people. What throughout the research process, though, I mean, how active of a participant was your father ultimately?
Well, not that active. He did, he would talk to me about stuff, but his memories of nearly everything were gone, and he had forgotten what he did have. Even the most basic things like these huge scrapbooks that were hidden away very cunningly in a corner in his study, or some other things. I mean, it wasn't as if he affected being upset when they did come to light. I think he was past that as well. But, there were other artifacts hidden around his study that I found, after he had moved on.
Yeah. When you say hidden, you mean quite literally he hid them?
Oh, yes. You had to really take all the books off the bookcases in two directions to find this hidden spot where the scrapbooks were.
Yeah. Which without getting into the symbolism, I shouldn't say without getting into symbolism, because we're going to get into the symbolism of somebody who had these memories that were so painful that he felt the need to literally physically hide them away, but was still holding on to them. I mean, what was his relationship, and do you understand why he felt the need to, in spite of everything, hold on to these mementos?
Because I think destroying them would have meant dealing with them. That's a form of dealing with something when you destroy it. But something you don't want to deal with at all, you hide away so you don't have to deal with it on any level whatsoever. That would have forced some kind of emotional realization, no matter how, small or immediate. Yeah.
So I should mention again that we're keep asking those questions. Ask them in the chat there in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end. You actually describe the process in the early chapters of the book of effectively pulling the narrative of the book together, or the story of your father together, through these pictures and other mementos that you pulled together. I'd love it if you could kind of walk us through that process a bit. And I know you've described it as a bit of a detective story. So, if you can show us, some of those images that.
Well,
that
I brought only a few, because otherwise we could be here for hours.
Sure.
I still have to scan the scrapbooks properly. I just photographed them very quickly, but there's, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of stuff. It's absolutely fascinating. And every time I look at it, I notice new details, because I do find the culture back then pretty interesting. And he floated right through an amazing cross section of it. So let me see. I'm going to share some images. I'm going to just start with these. Okay, that's not right. Yes. Okay, it's the cover of my book, and then that's my father. I think in his 30s there, possibly early 40s. That's him when he was at the height of his fame. I would say he's 6 then. Has a nice juicy lisp, and
so that would have been really kind of the first year of the show.
Yeah, where he was really a sensation. He was on the NBC Blue network. At that time, NBC had 2 radio networks, red and blue. And then in 1943, an FCC ruling forced them to give up one, which then became ABC. There we go. There's him on the show, age 8. And there's Harv Bennett on the far right, who later produced Star Trek Wrath of Khan.
Can you actually go back to that last one?
Sure.
I mentioned this because you were showing me some of the images before, and if you've read the book, you will find a lot of these really familiar. This is one of them. I could know for a fact, just looking at that picture in the middle, that this image was in the book. It is a comic, it is a graphic memoir, but it's set up in such a way, it's almost set up like a scrapbook where the
I
story
did
is
some,
told.
yeah, there's some copying of images. There's
Yeah.
interspersing of story and kind of the detritus. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So in a sense, I mean, do you feel like the story was kind of built around those images?
Yeah, I mean, the book haunts me because I had to do it at, fairly high speed under some high pressure situations. I had to, I had to be economical in my choices. And even then, as I said, I came in very close to deadline. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing I might even want to revisit someday, but it is kind of a certain focus I chose, to use the images to bear some of the story. And that's him at 12, where he was becoming pretty awkward, And this is, I think, before he was on TV. This is, once I'd researched his story, I started to see his reflection everywhere. And this is a case from the classic comic Nancy that is quite obviously meant to be him. This kid is also on the radio and a smartass. And this is kind of, I think, shows how Americans were beginning to feel about him, at least the younger ones, because he was being held up as an example. And, his use on the show frequently was also as foil for comedians. So he'd be the annoying kid they'd be trying to, talk through, kind of thing with Jack Benny or some of the others. So
What's interesting looking at the Nancy comic, he was one of the kids on this long running show. There were a lot of kids on the show. Why is it so clearly him versus any of the other children on the show?
Because he just, I don't know, he captured the public's imagination in a certain way as the loudmouth, know-it-all kid with spectacles. You can also see him, I mean, very obviously reflected in movies like Radio Days. There's the annoying kid on the radio who knows math and is really snotty. And you find that a lot, that people, clever, smart, funny people from that era who grew up really disliked him. There's that Nora Ephron quote I used too in the book.
Yeah.
There was something about him that was funny and kind of cute, but really annoying at the same time. And I think that's a certain recipe that can make people incredibly famous at the right moment in history. It's almost like he was a precursor for Urkel. I've never seen the show that Urkel was on. I've never, witnessed a moment of it, but I know who Urkel is and what he looks like generally and what he sounds like, because
he's an archetype.
Yeah, he permeated the culture to this level because of kind of marking a post out there of a certain extreme of human behavior.
I should say, and for whatever reason, the book fell right open to this. So the Nora Ephron quote, you're quoting her from 2007. So obviously several decades before the show was off air. She says, "I can't even look at Chuck Schumer without being reminded of an old radio and television show called Quiz Kids, which featured a boy genius named Joel Kupperman, who was always waving his hand wildly," which is funny because in all of the images, he has his hand up, waving his hand wildly whenever a question was asked and shouting, I know, I know. So whatever that says about both Joe Kupperman and our senator.
Yeah. But just that, that was the kind of residue he left of this kind of annoying character that people really resented a little, if not a lot. Anyway, I brought a few other images. Like I said, there are thousands, but let me just show a few more from the scrapbooks. Here we go. Right. So this, for instance, is the Esquire All-American Baseball Game, 1945. He was the ball boy for Ty Cobb, and the captain of the other team was Babe Ruth. This is, the kind of thing that the scrapbooks are full of. That's Dagmar. Or no, Hildegard, excuse me. This is the movie he was in playing himself. Yeah. That's him with Orson Welles, who, according to the news account I found of it, he was quite rude to.
He yeah, you talk about that in a little in the book. I mean, this is actually this obviously in the image, the card trick. He was showing him a magic trick. Is that right?
Yeah, he was showing him magic tricks and card tricks, and my father was, according to Sidney Skolsky, who wrote it down, just saying things like, "This is boring," and "Can we go?" You know.
Man. It's like Orson Welles didn't have a hard enough time of it without your father.
Well, that is something else funny I realized was that I think Orson Welles was teased with being like my father some in the 40s, because he had been a prodigy and was seen as a child prodigy still even to the mid-late 40s. There, I found at least a couple instances of people, you know, teasing him that he's like Joel Kupperman. So kind of funny. That's my father on one of the Universal sets when he was in the movie. He got to tour all the sets, and that's another one. I don't know what movie that's from, but this is Saturday Evening Post, full page drawing. They really treated him as if he was some kind of remarkable prodigy, and his math skill was kind of amazing, but I don't know if he was a prodigy. I don't think he really was. That's my grandparents, obviously. My grandfather normally doesn't look like that. I'm not sure what happened right before the picture was taken. Assume that expression, but he normally looks quite solemn.
What do you mean he wasn't a prodigy? I mean, what specifically, what do you mean by prodigy in this case?
Well, my father's argument when we talked about it was, he said that a prodigy is someone who starts doing something when they're young and is very impressive at it, and then keeps doing it as they get older. And then when they're an adult, they're really good at it. But with him, he didn't really do math after quiz kits, apart from doing his taxes. So either he wasn't a real prodigy, or he was and the show ruined it. Either of those, I guess, is possible. This is another picture from the scrapbook of him doing makeup, pretending to do makeup on one of the actresses from The Mummy's Hand, which was filming at the same time. She's very game. Same with Chico Marx, Eddie Cantor, Colonel Carlson of Carlson's Raiders, who's very bravely given him a machine gun to hold. Yeah, the scrapbooks, yeah, fascinating text.
That was the movie again.
That was the movie, Chip Off the Old Block, where he played himself.
You said in spite of being very good on the radio, is not a particularly convincing actor.
You can see him trying to not move his hands and stuff. You know, he has too much energy. And there are stills of him in a naval outfit, which suggests that scenes were to be filmed or were supposed to be filmed that weren't filmed, because there's nothing like that in the movie. Originally, it was supposed to be a movie version of this radio show called Duffy's Tavern. And then it became this vehicle. But the original idea they had for him, which they described in letters and telegrams, which I really liked, was that he would be in this Naval Academy building. He'd be in the attic looking at books, and professors would stick their heads up and ask him questions, and he'd give them the answers, which I thought that would have been pretty funny. Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, look out. And then this one, I just like this picture. Kind of sums it all up. He's on a naval, vessel, hanging out, having a glass of milk.
Standing on radios.
Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, and one more thing, actually. Hold on a sec. This is just something I brought a few of to this. These are the NBC comment cards. NBC. Okay. Yes. NBC would have their people type out on an index card every show. This is the very early days of NBC. So it's kind of fascinating to scour these and see what the guests were and what was going on. That was when they did a crossover with Milton Berle, who my dad actually, he was one of the few people he liked a lot. Franz Polgar, a famed hypnotist who had his own TV show, claimed to be Freud's hypnotist, but apparently was not. Yeah, Susan Cabot. I don't know if any of you know who that is, but Ruth St. Denis. Oh, yes, and they were alternating with the Paul Winchell, Jerry Mahoney show. And then let me see one thing. Hold on one second.
Follow Michael on Twitter for a good Jerry Mahoney story.
Right. For all these important stories. Where is it? Okay, yes. This is the card where they record what stations were adding the show, which I think must mean the stations that were joining NBC as it progressed towards being a national network in 1949. Anyway.
Great. Yeah. Well, we have actually had a lot more questions that I had believed originally, and I have a few more myself, but I think some of these actually cover them pretty nicely. So we'll go through some of these and see where we end up. So Aaron and Susan ask similar questions, and this is something I'm curious as well. 200, 214, 218 page book, which is, not enough time, obviously, to tell your father's entire life or deal with all of the problems between the two of you. The big outstanding question is, what did you leave out, and what do you wish that you had had more opportunity to expand on?
Well, I still kind of want to do a follow-up because there's a lot more I just feel the need to express about what it was like to be the child of not just parents, but generations of people who weren't really dealing with their stuff. And I think in some ways it was easier in the 20th century to not deal with your stuff. I think there was also, people seem to have an expectation that they were in stasis and things wouldn't change. For several decades, possibly that was true. But, myself and my wife had to clean out our family house, which was absolutely full of decades full of stuff. You'd open, chests, and there'd be stuff that hadn't been looked at since the early 60s. And then there were boxes upon boxes of their parents' stuff, which had all been packed up when they moved, passed on and shipped to them. And there were decades and decades of undealt with stuff there. And having all this go on while, in other ways, let's face it, society was collapsing. It was a heavy experience. There was a lot going on this last 10 years. And so I still feel like there's a story I want to continue with, not about him per se, but kind of about the effects and more about the interaction we had, especially towards the end. Yeah.
Do you anticipate actually starting work on that at some point?
Not anytime soon. When I get a chance. I did a mini comic, kind of did a short, I think it was a 34-page comic, just as a kind of place marker to give myself something to go back to. Right. But it's going to be a little while. I have a lot of other things, other projects I'm eager to get onto.
Yeah. This is really great. This next question from Ron R is really great. And I know obviously you lost your father, I guess about a year and a half ago, April of 2020, but it was a very slow decline before that, as far as the dementia and some of the other things that he was dealing with. Ron wants to know, he says, interesting framing device, starting and ending with your father's decline. Was that clear from the start, or did you come upon that idea while working on it?
That was fairly clear from the start. Since any attempt to research his life was, immediately led into stumbling blocks created by his, even when he was professing the opposite, his unwillingness to confront any of that material. So it was kind of I think by the time I actually started the draft of the book that became the final, it was obvious. Yeah. He was diagnosed in 2012. You know, there were a couple of years of what seemed like fairly slow progression, and then finally he had to be, placed in a home. And yeah, it's a terrible way to go out, and I'm anxious to do everything I can to avoid it. Slow decline for years, and then every time he had a slight chill or felt faint, they would rush him to the hospital. He'd stay there for 5 days. They'd do a lot of tests. Nothing would be shown. They never found a reason or seemed to really care about it. It was about other things. Take him back to the home. This recurred over and over and over, dozens. I don't know how many times. After it happened 3 times in 1 month, we finally managed to get him on hospice care, so there wouldn't be any more hospital visits. And then he outlived that. So it was back to this routine. And then COVID hit.
Yeah.
And at the end, the decision was to send him to the hospital or not. And we said, absolutely not. We don't want him going in a hospital hallway.
This was this was what, March, April in New York City, 2020.
This was when
this
it
was like,
hit.
yeah.
Yes. And it was not hard to see coming. So he passed away, right then. And on the death certificate, it says probably COVID.
There was, and I remember this at the time, and I remember you're losing him, and it in April there was a Time story that ran, but it ran in May, so a full month, and the headline of his obit is Joel Kupperman, scarred by success as a quiz kid, dies at 83. So even for obituaries, you usually get a pretty straightforward. You would assume it would just be Joel Kupperman, quiz kid, but that scarred word makes it into the headline of his obituary.
Yeah, and I had mixed feelings about it because that's me. That's basically, I did that. That's my book work. The person who wrote it read my book, and that informed the angle of the obituary. So it's I don't know, I can accept it, but it's something to know that that's what he wouldn't have wanted, and I made it happen. What can I say?
Yeah. A few more I want to go through here. I'm going to cut this one down a little bit from ATP. ATP, I assume that's all tomorrow's parties, asks, did you think about how family members would react?
Well, sure. I was worried most, I suppose, about my mother, who I had I think a pretty good relationship with, and she did not, in fact, seem terribly troubled. So that was really the only worry I had. My grandmother Sarah, she doesn't have a great reputation, so there was no one to come forward to fight for her. No one's come to tell me that I was wrong. Some people, I have received a few letters and emails here and there, and I did get 1 or 2 from ex-quiz kids, and one of them said, I don't think it's true that it was important that they be Jewish. That element was never suggested. And I almost feel like it doesn't matter if it's having that effect and that's being emphasized constantly. If that was the original intent, it's not really important. But it's also true that Lewis Cowan, like I said, he worked towards representation not for Jewish people only, but for African Americans and for all kinds of people. He was very much ahead of his time liberal. And I think when you have that awareness in one part of your work, it doesn't vanish in other parts. It's always at play. So, yeah, there was that. But apart from that, no. And I almost wanted more arguments, or at least decent arguments. There was a very strange review on one of the online stage journals where they said that Henry Ford wasn't that big in a force in anti-Semitism in America. And, what can you say to that? It's, but
my understanding is that Hitler had a picture of Henry Ford on his wall.
Yes, and some of the leading Nazis at the Nuremberg trials said it was Henry Ford that, introduced me to the idea of anti-Semitism and made it an attractive prospect. Oh, Brian, are you there? Hello?
Oh, sorry. I think I cut. I think my connection is cutting out. So I'm going to ask you one more, and then we can throw it to Gerald. Apologies for that.
Okay.
Robert C. wants to know: are there any obvious benefits or detriments to telling autobiography, or I guess memoir, visually? What are they?
Yeah. To me, it felt like the advantage of telling the story this way is that it's more intimate. You are kind of drawing the person through the book. What I wanted with this book more than anything was to tell it as a story, almost like you're telling it in a bar or a public place where someone has limited attention and you have to get your story through. I wanted to get my story, as comfortable and easy a ride as I possibly could, given that it's somewhat, depressing subject matter at times. So for that, I think, graphic narrative is maybe has it above other art forms, in that you can draw people into a more of a one-on-one and just pull them through the story, like they're being led on a fairground ride. At least that was my aspiration.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier online some of the frustrations. I mean, this is a very well-received book. Eisner nominated. You got a great quote from Jake Tapper on the front, and Gerald obviously mentioned all of the many accolades at the top. So it's been out for a few years, and certainly we'd like to see this in more people's hands and on more bookshelves. What are the best ways that people can support you in the book?
Oh, probably just buy it from one of the usual outlets. Yeah.
Buy it. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Follow you on Twitter.
That's about it. Yeah. Well, I don't know if following me on Twitter has to be part of the equation, but yeah.
Can you tell us what you are working on now?
Yeah, I have several projects. Obviously, during the last year and a half, partly because of my father's death and other stuff going on, I also had to take some time and pause and just work on myself, because the stress was enormous. But I have two projects I've been working on that I'm excited about. One is a comic sci-fi sort of graphic novel about a movie star who goes to sleep, wakes up in 1,000 years, and now being an anonymous person, he is put to work as a police spy, but finds that the issue of what is crime is a confusing one. And I think that's going to be quite funny. And then the other one I'm quite excited about is I was thinking about fairy tales a while back, and I took a look at a book I'd had since childhood, which is the original uncut East of the Sun, West of the Moon, the Scandinavian fairy tales book, and hit on one that featured Jesus and St. Peter as characters. And I started digging more and realized there was a vein of fairy tales. In fact, I think they're the oldest fairy tales that feature Christian saints as characters, but not behaving in the way that we expect Christian saints to behave now. Not necessarily immoral, but sometimes prankster-ish, or what we might consider cruel, or they're magical beings. So I'm working on a book of those.
More of a Loki situation, I suppose. Cool.
Well, standing back and there's a continuing thing where in these tales, for instance, where Jesus will bring someone back to life by putting them in an oven, and then some lay person tries it with disastrous results.
Yeah.
Let's just say sometimes Jesus steps in and sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he's just like, you messed up.
Yeah. Well, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
And I'll throw it over to Gerald.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you both. so much for doing this. Michael, the book is all the answers, and as you can see, we should all hold up our copies, and it's a wonderful read, and which has been further enriched by the conversation that the two of you have had. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us, and Brian for such a beautifully led interview that really helped us get to the bottom, or not to the bottom, but understand more the depth of what Michael has been handling. This has been the final virtual session of the Festival of Books, and it's brought to you by the Spencertown Academy, spencertownacademy.org, which is in Spencertown, Columbia County, New York. Have a look online. We have a book sale going on until October 31st with a lot of rare books, and new titles are being added all the time. And also, you might want to look at our YouTube channel, Spencertown Academy, because we will have this interview, we have the previous ones from this year's festival, and we have ones from last year: Joyce Carol Oates, Jill Lepore, Russell Shorto. It's been a remarkable collection of people we've been able to attract, Michael foremost among them. Thank you both. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but it's been a real pleasure listening to the two of you, and good night.
Thank you so much.